Have you ever wondered how a single intercepted whisper could decide the fate of hundreds of thousands of men? How the crackling static of primitive radio waves could become the difference between victory and annihilation? This is not a story about heroes in shining armor or grand cavalry charges across sunlit fields. This is a story about invisible weapons, about voices carried through the air that should never have been heard, about generals who played chess with human lives while listening to their opponents think aloud. What happened in the forests and marshes of East Prussia in August 1914 would rewrite the rules of warfare forever. And it all began with a Russian officer named Alexander Samsonov who never imagined that his words, transmitted through the ether, were being caught by ears that hungered for his destruction. The summer of 1914 was dying when General Alexander Vasilyevich Samsonov arrived at his new command. He was a man built like a bear, with a thick dark beard streaked with premature gray and eyes that carried the weight of too many winters on the Siberian frontier. At 55, he had spent more years in uniform than most men spent alive, and his body bore the evidence. A limp from a Japanese bullet at Mukden, a scar across his left hand from a Cossack saber during training exercises gone wrong, and a persistent cough from months spent in the frozen trenches of Manchuria. He was not a man who believed in the romance of war. He had seen too much death for that, had written too many letters to widows, had watched too many young men die calling for mothers who would never answer. But duty was duty, and when the Tsar called, Samsonov answered. His orders were clear: command the Russian Second Army and invade East Prussia from the south, while General Pavel Rennenkampf's First Army pushed in from the east. Together, they would crush the Germans in a massive pincer movement, sweep through Prussia, and march triumphantly toward Berlin. The plan looked perfect on paper, drawn with confident strokes by staff officers in St. Petersburg who had never heard a bullet snap past their heads or smelled the copper-sweet stench of a battlefield 3 days after the guns fell silent. What those staff officers did not know, what Samsonov himself did not know, was that every word he spoke into his radio transmitter was being heard by German ears. Every order, every position report, every moment of uncertainty was being transcribed by enemy operators and rushed to a pair of German commanders who would use that information like a scalpel, cutting the Russian Second Army to pieces with surgical precision. On the German side, 2 men stood in a commandeered school building in the town of Osterode, staring at maps covered with colored pins and penciled lines. General Paul von Hindenburg was 67 years old, recalled from retirement when the war broke out because Germany's younger generals were needed in France. He was tall and solid, with a face like weathered granite and a white mustache that drooped over his upper lip. He moved with the deliberate care of a man who had learned that haste in war led only to graves. Before the war had pulled him back, he had been living quietly with his wife, tending his garden, writing memoirs that no publisher wanted, facing the slow fade into irrelevance that awaited all old soldiers. The call to service had given him one final chance at significance, and he did not intend to waste it. Beside him stood Major General Erich Ludendorff, 49 years old and burning with an intensity that made younger officers uncomfortable. Where Hindenburg was patient ice, Ludendorff was controlled fire. He had thin lips pressed into a perpetual line of concentration, eyes that never stopped calculating, and a mind that processed tactical information the way a machine processed coal, relentlessly, efficiently, extracting every ounce of useful energy. He had proven himself at Liège in Belgium, where his audacity had cracked the supposedly impregnable Belgian fortresses. Now he had been sent east to serve as Hindenburg's chief of staff, and the partnership was already showing signs of terrible effectiveness. Between them, on the wooden desk that had once held a schoolmaster's lesson plans, sat a stack of rioting radio messages. Russian messages. Clear, unencrypted, absurdly detailed Russian messages. "They're still doing it," Ludendorff said, his finger tapping the latest transcript. His voice carried a note of disbelief that never entirely faded, no matter how many intercepts arrived. Samsonov just transmitted his entire order of march, divisional positions, artillery placements, supply routes, everything. Hindenburg picked up the paper, reading slowly. He had learned Russian during his early military career, and though decades had passed, the language came back easily. Too easily. Their codes are either non-existent or so simple our operators break them in minutes. And this, he held up another message. This one isn't even encoded. Plain Russian, transmitted in the open. Why would they be so careless? Ludendorff asked, though he already knew the answer. The question was rhetorical, the kind officers asked when confronted with enemy incompetence so profound it seemed impossible. Because they don't believe we're listening, or perhaps they don't believe it matters. The Russian army is massive. They outnumber us 3-1 in this theater. When you have that kind of numerical superiority, I suppose you grow arrogant. You start to believe that tactics don't matter, that strategy is secondary to the sheer weight of men and guns. Ludendorff turned back to the map, his eyes tracing the movements of the Russian forces. Two massive armies, Samsonov's and Rennenkampf's, converging on East Prussia like the jaws of a vice. Between them, scattered across the countryside, were German units that looked pathetically inadequate by comparison. But those Russian armies were not coordinating properly. Rennenkampf to the north was moving too slowly, as if he had all the time in the world, and Samsonov, pushing up from the south, was outrunning his supply lines and spreading his forces thin. There's bad blood between them, Hindenburg observed, noting the same tactical gap that Ludendorff had spotted. Samsonov and Rennenkampf, they've hated each other since Mukden, some quarrel about cavalry deployments that turned into a fistfight on a train platform. The whole Russian officer corps knows about it. Personal grudges have no place in war, Ludendorff said, but even as he spoke, he was calculating how to exploit exactly that. If Rennenkampf's hatred for Samsonov made him slow to support his fellow general, if that old train station brawl had left wounds that infected their tactical cooperation, then the Germans could slip between the two Russian armies and destroy them separately. Personal grudges, Hindenburg replied, are exactly what war is made of. Nations go to war because of personal grudges writ large. Why should generals be any different? He set down the intercept and looked at his chief of staff. Can we do it? Can we stop Samsonov before Rennenkampf realizes what's happening? Ludendorff was quiet for a long moment, his mind running through logistics and timing, calculating the movement of battalions and the capacity of railways, weighing the risks of leaving Rennenkampf unobserved while they concentrated against Samsonov. It was a gamble, the kind of desperate maneuver that either won wars or ended careers. But the alternative was to fight both Russian armies at once, and that meant certain defeat. Yes, Ludendorff said finally, we can do it, but we need to move now, and we need to move everything we have. We pull our forces away from Rennenkampf, just leave cavalry screens to watch him, and we throw every division, every gun, every man we can spare at Samsonov. We hit him from 3 sides while his units are still separated. We use his own radio messages to track his movements and stay 1 step ahead. We encircle him before he realizes the trap is closing. And if Rennenkampf decides to help his old enemy? Hindenburg asked. Then we die gloriously, Ludendorff said with a thin smile that held no humor. But I don't think he will. Not quickly enough to matter. Whatever happened between them on that train platform was poisonous enough that Rennenkampf will wait just long enough to ensure we're committed before he moves. By then, it'll be too late for Samsonov. Hindenburg nodded slowly. He had lived long enough to know that wars were won not by the righteous, but by the ruthless, not by those who played fair, but by those who played smart. The Russians had handed them a gift, unencrypted communications, poor coordination, commanders who hated each other. To refuse that gift would be worse than foolish. It would be criminal.
Issue the orders, he said. We march on Samsonov. In the forests south of Allenstein, Samsonov's Second Army was advancing through territory that seemed designed by malicious gods to confound military operations. The region was a nightmare of dense woodland, treacherous swamps, and narrow roads that turned to soup under the weight of artillery wagons. The August heat was oppressive, turning uniforms into sweat-soaked rags and making every mile feel like 3. Men marched with their collars open, their faces red and slick, their water bottles empty hours before the next well appeared. Samsonov rode near the front of the column, his horse picking its way carefully along a road that was more suggestion than reality. Around him, his staff officers maintained the professional silence of men who had learned not to complain in front of the general, but their faces told stories of exhaustion and growing concern. They were moving too fast, pushing too hard, and the supply wagons were falling further behind with each passing day. The men were eating half rations, the horses were going lame, and still the orders from Samsonov were the same: advance, advance, advance. Lieutenant Colonel Pyotr Markov rode beside the general, his role as chief of communications making him one of the most overworked officers in the army. He was 32, younger than most men at his rank, with the kind of lean, nervous energy that came from too much coffee and too little sleep. His uniform was dusty from the road, and his eyes had the red-rimmed look of a man who hadn't slept properly in days. In his saddlebag was a portable radio transmitter, the new technology that was supposed to revolutionize warfare by allowing instant communication across vast distances. In practice, it was a temperamental beast that required constant adjustment, careful positioning, and operators who understood the difference between signal clarity and static noise. "We're 20 kilometers ahead of schedule," Markov reported, consulting notes that threatened to blow away in the hot wind. "But the 15th Corps is lagging. They're still crossing the marsh country near Sildau, and their artillery is having trouble with the roads." Samsonov grunted. "Tell them to leave the heavy guns if they have to. We need speed more than we need firepower right now. The Germans are retreating. We saw their rear guards yesterday. If we push hard enough, we can catch them before they establish defensive positions." Markov made a note but didn't look happy about it. "Sir, the supply situation will resolve itself once we capture German depots. The enemy is running. Running armies leave behind food, ammunition, everything we need. We just have to catch them." He said it with the confidence of a man who had seen retreating armies before, who had pursued fleeing enemies across the steppes of Manchuria and watched them dissolve into panicked mobs. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that this particular retreat was different. The Germans weren't running in panic. They were being deliberately pulled back, carefully repositioned, concentrated for a counterstroke that would fall on the Russian Second Army like a hammer on an anvil. That evening, Samsonov's headquarters was established in a farmhouse that smelled of old hay and chicken droppings. Maps were spread across a kitchen table, while staff officers crowded around, marking positions and calculating distances. Markov set up the radio equipment in what had been a bedroom, stringing antenna wire out through the window and adjusting frequencies until he could hear the crackle of distant transmissions. "Get me a line to 1st Army headquarters. I need to coordinate with Rennenkampf. We're getting too far apart. If the Germans counterattack, we need to be able to support each other." Markov worked the radio, calling out into the electronic void, but the response that came back was frustratingly vague. First Army was advancing, yes, but slowly. Rennenkampf was being cautious, consolidating his positions, waiting for supplies to catch up. There was no sense of urgency in the messages, no indication that Rennenkampf understood they were supposed to be working together. Each transmission Markov sent was clear, detailed, specifying exactly where Samsonov's forces were and where they would be tomorrow. And each transmission was heard not just by Rennenkampf's operators, but by German listening posts scattered across East Prussia. 20 kilometers away, in a German signal station hidden in the woods, a young operator named Hans Gruber sat hunched over his equipment, transcribing every word that came crackling through his headphones. He was 19 years old, with the soft face of someone who never expected to be in uniform. Before the war, he had been studying electrical engineering at the university in Königsberg, fascinated by the new science of wireless communication. When war broke out, his expertise had made him far too valuable to waste in the infantry. Instead of a rifle, he carried headphones. Instead of shooting enemies, he listened to them. "Another one from Samsonov," Gruber called out to his sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Weiss who had been pulling signals intelligence since the days when it meant cutting telegraph wires and reading stolen documents. "He's transmitting his position again. Clear Russian, no encryption." Sergeant Weiss came over, reading the transcript over Gruber's shoulder. "Are they insane? Do they want us to know where they are? Maybe they think we can't hear them. Or maybe they don't think it matters." "It matters," Weiss said grimly. He grabbed the transcript and headed for the door, where a motorcycle courier was already waiting. Within an hour, that piece of paper would be on Ludendorff's desk. Within 2 hours, German units would be moving to exploit the information it contained. This was the invisible battle, the war fought in radio waves and cipher keys, where victory went not to the bravest or the strongest, but to those who listened best. And in this battle, the Germans were winning overwhelmingly. The next morning, Samsonov's forces continued their advance, pushing deeper into Prussia. The men were tired but confident, singing marching songs that echoed through the forests. They had seen German rear guards falling back, had occupied abandoned villages where breakfast dishes still sat on tables and bread was fresh in ovens. Every sign suggested the enemy was in full retreat, that victory was just a few more days of hard marching away. But the Germans weren't retreating. They were repositioning. While Samsonov's army spread itself over 50 kilometers of front, German units were being pulled from the north and concentrated into a massive force that would strike at the flanks of the Russian Second Army. Train after train arrived at German railheads, disorganizing battalions that immediately began forced marches towards predetermined positions. Ludendorff worked 18-hour days, moving units with the precision of a watchmaker adjusting springs and gears. Hindenburg provided the steady hand and calm authority that kept the operation from descending into chaos. And through it all, the radio intercepts kept coming. Samsonov continued to broadcast in the clear, continued to tell the Germans exactly where his forces were and where they were going tomorrow. And each message was heard not just by Rennenkampf's operators, but by German listening posts scattered across East Prussia. On August 26th, the trap began to close. German forces struck at both flanks of Samsonov's army, catching Russian units while they were strung out along forest roads, separated from their artillery, exhausted from days of forced marching. The attacks came with devastating suddenness. Russian soldiers who had been expecting to pursue a retreating enemy suddenly found themselves under assault from multiple directions, with German infantry emerging from tree lines they thought were empty, and German artillery shells falling with uncanny accuracy on positions the Russians had just occupied. Lieutenant Colonel Pyotr Markov was at a forward command post when the first reports came in. His radio crackled to life with frantic transmissions from divisional commanders, reporting heavy attacks, requesting reinforcements, asking for orders. He transcribed everything with shaking hands, the magnitude of the disaster becoming clearer with each message. The flanks were collapsing. Units were being surrounded. The Germans weren't retreating. They never had been. This whole time they had been preparing an ambush, and now that ambush was springing shut. "Get me General Samsonov!" Markov shouted to a runner. "Now!"
But Samsonov was already on his way, having heard the distant thunder of artillery fire that signaled the beginning of the German assault. He arrived at the command post with his uniform covered in dust, his face grim. "What's happening?" Markov handed him the stack of transcripts. "We're under attack from 3 sides. The Germans are hitting our flanks hard, and they seem to know exactly where we are. Our units are scattered, and the Germans are cutting through them. Sir, we're being encircled." Samsonov read through the messages, his expression darkening with each page. He had been in enough battles to recognize what was happening. This wasn't a defensive counterattack. This was a carefully planned operation, executed with precision that spoke of excellent intelligence. But how? How had the Germans known where to strike? "Pull the flanks back," he ordered. "Contract our line. Concentrate our forces. We need to create a defensive perimeter until Rennenkampf can come up from the north and relieve the pressure. I've been trying to reach First Army headquarters for hours. They're not responding. Or, if they are, we're not receiving their transmissions. Keep trying. Send riders if you have to. We need support, and we need it now." Samsonov turned to his other staff officers, firing off orders with the calm efficiency of a man who had been in tight situations before. But inside, a cold dread was growing. Something was very wrong. The Germans were moving too confidently, striking too accurately. It was as if they could read his mind, anticipate his moves before he made them. Because they could. Every order Samsonov gave, every position he reported, every request for support he transmitted to Rennenkampf, All of it was being intercepted and transcribed by German operators who rushed the information to their commanders. Ludendorff was reading Samsonov's orders before some of Samsonov's own units received them. The German staff was literally planning their movements based on Russian radio traffic, using Samsonov's own words to predict where he would move next and how to counter it. Over the next 3 days, the Battle of Tannenberg became a masterclass in the use of signals intelligence. German forces continued to tighten the noose, using intercepted radio messages to identify weak points in the Russian line and then hammering those weak points with concentrated assaults. Russian units that tried to maneuver found German forces already in position to block them. Russian artillery that displaced to new positions found German counter-battery fire landing on them within minutes. It was like fighting an opponent who could see 5 moves ahead, who knew every card in your hand before you played it. Samsonov's army was being systematically destroyed, torn apart by an enemy that seemed omniscient. Russian soldiers fought with desperate courage, launching counterattacks against overwhelming odds, holding positions long after they should have been abandoned. But courage wasn't enough. No amount of bravery could compensate for the catastrophic intelligence failure that had exposed every Russian movement to enemy observation. In the forests near Froggenau, a Russian infantry battalion made its last stand on August 28th. They had been cut off from the main force, surrounded by German units that were closing in from all sides. Their commander, Colonel Viktor Petrov, was a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War who had survived Port Arthur and thought he had seen the worst that war could offer. He was wrong. His men dug shallow trenches in the forest floor, positioned their machine guns to cover the approaches, and waited. They had no illusions about relief arriving. The radio was silent. No one was answering their calls. They were alone, and they knew how this would end. The German assault came at dawn, waves of field-gray uniforms moving through the trees with methodical efficiency. The Russian machine guns chattered, cutting down the first wave, but there was always another wave behind it. German artillery had their range, dropping shells that exploded in the treetops and sent deadly splinters of wood and metal raining down. The Russians fought back with rifles and grenades, with bayonets when the Germans got close enough, with rocks and fists when they ran out of ammunition. By mid-morning, it was over. The last Russian soldiers raised their hands in surrender, stepping out from behind shattered trees with their faces black with powder smoke and their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Colonel Viktor Petrov was among them, his right arm hanging useless at his side from a shell fragment. A German officer approached, a young captain who looked barely old enough to shave, and offered a canteen of water. "You fought well," the captain said in passable Russian. Petrov drank deeply, then handed back the canteen. "What does it matter? We lost." "You were betrayed by your own radios," the captain said, and there was no gloating in his voice, only a kind of professional sympathy. "Every message you sent, we heard. Every position you reported, we knew about before you reached it. Your generals might as well have been handing us their battle plans." Petrov stared at him, the full horror of it sinking in. "The radios? You were listening to our radios?" "Every word. You never encrypted anything. It was like reading a newspaper." And with that, Petrov understood. His men hadn't died because they were cowards or incompetents. They had died because somewhere up the chain of command, someone had made the catastrophic decision to use radio communications without proper security. Every brave soldier, every defensive position, every tactical maneuver, all of it had been rendered meaningless because the enemy could hear them talking. Samsonov never learned about that conversation. By August 29th, he knew his army was finished, but he didn't yet understand why. His forces were in full retreat, or trying to retreat, but every route they took seemed to be blocked by German units already in position. It was like being in a nightmare where every door you opened led to the same terrible room. That night, Samsonov called a final conference with his surviving staff officers. They met in a forest clearing, with no headquarters building, no comfortable rooms, just exhausted men gathering around a dying fire.
The radio equipment had been destroyed to keep it from German hands, which meant they were finally, ironically, safe from enemy interception, but also cut off from any hope of coordination or rescue. "Gentlemen," Samsonov said, his voice rough with exhaustion, "we have lost this battle. The question now is how many of our men we can save." He looked at each face around the fire, seeing his own despair reflected back. "I want every unit to break up into small groups and try to infiltrate back towards Russian lines. No large formations, they're too easy to spot and surround. Tell the men to abandon everything except their rifles and whatever food they can carry. Speed and stealth are their only chances now." "What about you, sir?" Lieutenant Colonel Markov asked. Samsonov was quiet for a long moment. "I'll stay with the rear guard, cover the withdrawal for as long as possible." They all knew what that meant. The rear guard would die. That was the whole point, hold the enemy's attention while others escaped. It was a sentence of death, and Samsonov had just pronounced it on himself. "Sir, you can't," one of the younger officers began, but Samsonov cut him off. "Yes, I can. I commanded this army. I led these men into this disaster. The least I can do is give them a chance to survive it." He pulled off his signet ring and handed it to Markov. "Get this back to my wife if you can. Tell her I did my duty." The officers dispersed into the darkness, moving quietly through the forest towards Russian lines that seemed impossibly far away. Most would be captured before they got there. Some would die fighting. A handful would make it through and carry word of the catastrophe back to Russian headquarters. Samsonov walked into the forest alone. He didn't lead any rear guard action. That was a lie to give his officers an excuse to leave him. He simply walked deeper into the trees, away from the sounds of battle, away from the shame of defeat. At some point, no one knows exactly when, he drew his service revolver and placed it against his temple. The single shot echoed through the forest and was swallowed by the greater noise of war.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
His body was found weeks later by local civilians and buried in a quiet cemetery far from home. The man who had been betrayed by invisible radio waves, who had fought an enemy that could hear his every word, had chosen silence as his final refuge. When news of Tannenberg reached St. Petersburg, the scale of the disaster shocked everyone. An entire army, nearly 200,000 men, had been destroyed. Over 50,000 Russian soldiers were dead. Another 92,000 were prisoners. The Germans had captured 500 guns, vast quantities of supplies, and, most importantly, had won a victory that would echo through the rest of the war. In the German headquarters, Hindenburg and Ludendorff stood once more before their maps, but now those maps showed German positions where Russian ones had been marked just days before. They had won one of the most complete victories in modern military history, and they had done it not through superior numbers or better equipment, but through superior intelligence. "The radio intercepts made the difference," Ludendorff said, stating the obvious because sometimes the obvious needed to be acknowledged. "Without them, we would have been fighting blind, outnumbered, and overwhelmed." "The Russians handed us this victory," Hindenburg agreed. "They told us their plans, showed us their positions, revealed their weaknesses. All we had to do was listen." News of the German signals intelligence success spread through military circles, though much of the details remained classified. Other armies began to take encryption seriously, to train operators in proper communications security, to understand that in modern war, invisible weapons could be just as deadly as bullets and shells. The age of electronic warfare had begun, born in the forests of East Prussia, where Russian voices had been carried through the air into enemy ears. But the human cost of that lesson was staggering. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers had died not because they were cowards or fools, but because their commanders had failed to understand the new realities of technological warfare. The telegraph had been around for decades, but radio was different. Radio could be heard by anyone with the right equipment.
Every transmission was a broadcast to friend and enemy alike. Without encryption, without proper security protocols, every radio message was an invitation for the enemy to listen in on your most private conversations. In Moscow, in the archives of the Russian Military Intelligence Service, there was a file on Tannenberg that would not be opened for decades. When historians finally gained access to it, they found transcripts of the German radio intercepts translated back into Russian. Page after page of messages that Samsonov and his staff had sent, thinking they were secure, not knowing that every word was being captured and analyzed by enemy operators. One transcript stood out, dated August 26th, just as the German trap was springing shut. It was from Samsonov to Rennenkamp, a desperate plea for support. Under heavy attack from 3 directions, request immediate reinforcement, situation critical. Rennenkamp's response had been terse and cold. First Army is consolidating positions, cannot support at this time. Whether that refusal was due to genuine tactical concerns or lingering personal animosity from their years-old quarrel, no one would ever know for certain. What was certain was that Rennenkamp's delay in supporting Samsonov had given the Germans time to complete their encirclement and destruction of the Second Army. But even that bitter exchange paled compared to the final intercepted message in the file, sent by Samsonov on the evening of August 29th, his last radio transmission before ordering the equipment destroyed. It was addressed to no one in particular, just sent out into the electronic void. God forgive us, we did not know they were listening. 7 words that summarized the entire catastrophe. 7 words that explained how a brave army was destroyed by an enemy that fought with invisible weapons. 7 words that marked the beginning of a new age in warfare, where information was as valuable as ammunition, and the ability to keep secrets was as important as the ability to aim a rifle. In the years that followed, the Battle of Tannenberg became required study at military academies around the world. Not for the tactics of the encirclement, those were relatively conventional, but for the revolutionary use of signals intelligence. Future generals and admirals learned about Hans Gruber and his fellow operators, sitting in their hidden listening posts, transcribing enemy communications and turning them into tactical advantages. They learned about the importance of encryption, of communication security, of understanding that in an age of radio, silence could be more valuable than speech. The technology evolved rapidly. By the Second World War, both sides would employ thousands of cryptographers, would develop machines like Enigma and Ultra, would fight entire shadow wars over the ability to read enemy codes. The foundation for all of that was laid in the forests of East Prussia in 1914, where Russian voices had traveled through the air into German hands and turned the tide of battle. But the human cost of that lesson was staggering. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers had died not because they were cowards or fools, but because their commanders had failed to understand the new realities of technological warfare. The telegraph had been around for decades, but radio was different. Radio could be heard by anyone with the right equipment. Every transmission was a broadcast to friend and enemy alike. Without encryption, without proper security protocols, every radio message was an invitation for the enemy to listen in on your most private conversations. In Moscow, in the archives of the Russian Military Intelligence Service, there was a file on Tannenberg that would not be opened for decades. When historians finally gained access to it, they found transcripts of the German radio intercepts translated back into Russian. Page after page of messages that Samsonov and his staff had sent, thinking they were secure, not knowing that every word was being captured and analyzed by enemy operators. One transcript stood out, dated August 26th, just as the German trap was springing shut. It was from Samsonov to Rennenkamp, a desperate plea for support. Under heavy attack from 3 directions, request immediate reinforcement, situation critical. Rennenkamp's response had been terse and cold. First Army is consolidating positions, cannot support at this time.
Whether that refusal was due to genuine tactical concerns or lingering personal animosity from their years-old quarrel, no one would ever know for certain. What was certain was that Rennenkampf's delay in supporting Samsonov had given the Germans time to complete their encirclement and destruction of the Second Army. But even that bitter exchange paled compared to the final intercepted message in the file, sent by Samsonov on the evening of August 29th, his last radio transmission before ordering the equipment destroyed. It was addressed to no one in particular, just sent out into the electronic void. God forgive us, we did not know they were listening. 7 words that summarized the entire catastrophe. 7 words that explained how a brave army was destroyed by an enemy that fought with invisible weapons. 7 words that marked the beginning of a new age in warfare, where information was as valuable as ammunition, and the ability to keep secrets was as important as the ability to aim a rifle.
The battlefield itself has been absorbed back into farmland and forest. If you walk through those woods today, you might find occasional reminders. A shell casing corroded by decades of weather, a stone marker where some forgotten unit made its last stand, the overgrown remnants of trenches that once sheltered desperate men. But mostly, the forest has reclaimed everything. Nature has no memory of radio waves or encrypted messages or generals who broadcast their plans to listening enemies. Yet the lessons of Tannenberg endure. In every modern military communication center, in every encryption protocol, in every training manual that teaches young soldiers about operational security, the ghost of that battle lingers. We live now in an age where electronic surveillance is ubiquitous, where conversations can be monitored from satellites in orbit, where the ability to intercept and decode enemy communications is a fundamental pillar of national defense. All of that traces its lineage back to those German listening posts in 1914, to operators like Hans Gruber transcribing Russian voices that should never have been heard. The invisible battle, the war of information and intelligence, of signals and secrets, became just as important as the visible one. In some conflicts, it became more important. Soldiers still fought and died in trenches and bunkers and city streets, but increasingly, the battles that mattered most were fought in cipher rooms and listening stations, in the electronic realm, where voices traveled as electromagnetic waves and could be captured, decoded, exploited. And at the center of it all, forever, was the memory of Alexander Samsonov, the general who had been too confident, too trusting, too certain that his words were his own. His last walk into the forest, that final moment when he chose silence over the shame of speaking and being overheard, became a kind of parable. In the modern age, there was no such thing as a private conversation. Every word you spoke might be heard by ears you never intended. Every message you sent might be read by eyes you never expected. The only true security was silence, and even that was not guaranteed. The soldiers who died at Tannenberg, Russian boys from villages whose names no one remembers, German farm laborers who had never wanted to be soldiers, officers from aristocratic families who thought war would be a grand adventure. They all became part of that lesson. Their deaths purchased knowledge, though it was knowledge that came at a terrible price. Wars have a way of accelerating technological change, of forcing innovations that might have taken decades to develop in peacetime. The First World War gave us tanks and aircraft, poison gas and modern artillery, and countless other military innovations that would shape the 20th century. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the invisible one, the birth of electronic warfare, the understanding that information was a weapon as powerful as any gun. That understanding came from Tannenberg, from the forests of East Prussia where Russian voices had been carried through the air and captured by listening enemies. It came from the radio operators on both sides, the generals who learned to exploit intelligence, the soldiers who died without ever knowing that their commander's words had betrayed their positions. It came from one man's last walk into the forest, seeking in death the privacy he had never managed to secure in life. The radios at Tannenberg were primitive things by modern standards, bulky, temperamental, with limited range and poor signal quality.
But they were powerful enough to change the world, powerful enough to kill an army, powerful enough to teach humanity that in the age of electronic communication, there were no longer any secrets that could be kept forever. There were only secrets that hadn't been discovered yet, voices that hadn't been overheard yet, messages that hadn't been intercepted yet. When Alexander Samsonov transmitted his final message, "God forgive us, we did not know they were listening," he was speaking for an entire generation of soldiers and commanders who had to learn, often fatally, that the old rules no longer applied. The battlefield had expanded beyond what eyes could see or guns could reach. It now encompassed the entire electromagnetic spectrum, invisible but infinitely exploitable. And somewhere in that expanding battlefield, in the spaces between radio stations and listening posts, in the silence after that final transmission, in the empty air where once there had been voices calling out coordinates and orders and desperate pleas for help, the ghost of Tannenberg still whispers its warning. Be careful what you say. Someone is always listening. In war, as in life, your words can kill you, especially when you don't know who's hearing them. The sun sets now over those East Prussian forests, as it has for millions of years, indifferent to human conflict, unconcerned with the rise and fall of empires. But if you listen carefully, if you have the right equipment and the right frequency, you might still hear something in the static, echoes of transmissions from a century ago, voices of men who never knew they were broadcasting to their enemies, the silent thunder of invisible weapons that changed warfare forever. That's the real story of Tannenberg, not just a battle won or lost, but a threshold crossed, a moment when humanity stepped into a new age and discovered that the greatest dangers were often the ones you couldn't see, the ones that traveled through the air on wings of electromagnetic radiation and turned your own words into weapons aimed at your heart. And in the end, all that remains is the lesson, written in the blood of thousands. In the modern world, silence is golden. Everything else is just broadcasting your position to whoever cares to listen.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.